In this activity, we will go through a number of examples that highlight the key points from the previous video. When documenting findings, you must address all parts of the criterion and you must fully document the relevant evidence. Note that these examples should be considered only as good examples of how to address criteria with multiple aspects and not as recipes for findings. Each finding will be unique to each circumstance. Let's look at criterion 4.1 on life cycle assessment. For part B, when you audit an entity that provides cradle-to-gate LCA information, this must be stated, like it is mentioned in this public headline statement, for example. Part C requires that public communication on LCA information includes its underlying assumptions, including system boundaries. And when the LCA is publicly available, a link to access the LCA report referencing the relevant page and section numbers must be included in the public headline statement. This public headline statement addresses all the components of the criterion and fully documents the relevant evidence, in this case through the link and its proper page and section reference to access the LCA information. Let's now look at criterion 4.4 on collection and recycling of products at end of life. Subcriterion A requires that recycling programs be captured in a formal recycling strategy. This strategy shall include specific timelines, activities, and targets for products at end of life. The audit report should show that a strategy is in place and that it includes those three elements. Subcriterion B requires that the entity engages with local, regional, or national collection and recycling systems to support accurate measurement and efforts to increase recycling rates in their respective markets for their products containing aluminum. This engagement part must be addressed, whether the entity engages with collection and recycling systems or not. Criterion 6.1 on emissions to air. This criterion not only requires the entity to quantify and report emissions, but also to implement plans to minimize these adverse impacts. Do not forget this part and clearly state if a plan has been developed and how it has been implemented. On criterion 6.3, assessment and management of spills and leakage, Part B requires the entity to have management and external communication plans, compliance controls, and a monitoring program in place. All these aspects must be clearly referenced in your findings, whether they are separate or combined. For criteria 6.4 on reporting of spills, entities are required to have a system in place for public disclosure of spills, impact of the spills, and remediation methods. And the disclosure is in two parts. For 6.4a, you must reference the disclosure of the volume, type, and potential impact of significant spills. This information is disclosed to affected parties. As you can see, all the information are correctly referenced in this public headline statement. 6.4b is about the annual public reporting of the spills. And you must not forget to also reference the remediation actions taken. If there are no spills, there is nothing to report, but this must be mentioned in the observations and findings and in the public headline statement, like in this example. Now let's look at criterion 7.1b on water assessment in the entity's area of influence. You must state what area of influence was assessed and address whether the water-related risks covered the relevant watershed in the entity's area of influence. You must also describe the outcome of the risk assessment, even if the water-related risks were found to be low. This example of observations and findings properly documents the area of influence and addresses the whole criterion. Criterion 8.2 on biodiversity management includes several requirements that must all be addressed. First, subcriterion A requires the entity to implement the biodiversity action plan with time-bound targets. It also requires to monitor its effectiveness. As we can see in this example, both aspects are addressed. Subcriterion B then requires the biodiversity action plan to be consultative. It also requires the plan to be developed in accordance with the biodiversity mitigation hierarchy. Do not forget to address those components. And subcriterion C requires to publicly disclose the achieved biodiversity outcomes. If they are not disclosed, it must be clearly stated, and if they are, a link to access the disclosure referencing the page or section must be included in the public headline statement. Now let's look at criterion 9.1c on human rights due diligence. It requires that where the entity identifies as having caused or contributed to adverse human rights impacts, it shall provide for or cooperate in their remediation through legitimate processes. This covers all the entity's activities, not just its suppliers. You must be clear in the observations and findings and the public headline statement on how remediation is provided or is planned for, as in this example. Now that we addressed issues for the performance standard, let's look at a few common issues found in audit reports against the chain of custody standard, and let's start with criterion 6.1c that applies to post-cast house entities. The information and evidence provided must reflect the potential to source directly from another ASI COC certified entity or via traceable COC documentation coming directly from another COC certified entity or from a trader or warehouse. You must describe what type of systems are in place for one or both of these options as relevant in the observations and findings, even when the entity has not received any COC documentation yet, like in this example. Criteria 7.1 are on adopting and communicating to suppliers of non-COC material and recyclable scrap material a responsible sourcing policy. The four components must all be correctly referenced: anti-corruption, responsible sourcing, human rights due diligence, and conflict-affected and high-risk areas, as this is the case in this example where the four elements are referenced. In criteria 8.11, the two subcriteria are different to specifically address the two separate positive balance-related requirements. A is about identifying any carryover of a positive balance, while B is about the expiry of the potential carryover at the end of the subsequent material accounting period. Make sure to write two distinct findings for the two subcriteria and that each one properly addresses its requirement. Criterion 9.3 says that the entity may also include the applicable sustainability data in the COC document. This requirement is not mandatory, but all parts of the criteria must still be addressed: the supply chain activity, the disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions, and the disclosure of the ASI certification status for the ASI performance standard. Whether it is not applicable or the entity is in conformance, all aspects must be addressed, as in those three examples.